Good afternoon. My name is Tamilyn Tucker-Wergs. I'm the chair of the Political Science Department here at Hood College, and I'm so pleased to welcome all of you to the first event of the Political Science Department's Race, Politics, and Public Policy series, The Case Against the Electoral College, How the Electoral College Undermines Racial Equality and Democracy, which will be presented by Dr. Elizabeth Bennion. But before we introduce Dr. Bennion, I want to take a minute to talk to you about the Race, Politics, and Public Policy series. Given current events, the COVID-19 crisis, the uprisings against police brutality, the impending presidential elections, this is clearly a time when we could all use a better understanding of politics. The Political Science Department has planned a year-long series with the theme Race, Politics, and Public Policy. And we were inspired to create this series when in the weeks after George Floyd was killed and the subsequent protests, we heard from a number of students and former students about the impact that their hood education, particularly the courses that examine race and racism, had on their lives. We're in hopes that this series will increase our collective understanding about race and politics, and furthermore, help move us toward a better, more just society. We plan to sponsor lectures, panels, films, and invite scholars like Dr. Bennion to share important ideas that will help us in this endeavor. I want to thank all of you all for coming and sharing in this journey with us. And I also want to thank Ms. Hillary Stiepleman and Faculty Services and our co-sponsors, the Martha Church Center for Civic and Community Engagement, and Provost Debbie Ricker, and the African American Studies Program. I would now like to introduce Dr. Katie Robidek, who will introduce our speaker for the evening. Dr. Katie, as her students fondly call her, is a new assistant professor of political science here at Hood College and director of the Martha E. Church Center for Civic and Community Engagement. A political theorist with a broad training in the history of ancient through contemporary political thought, and she focuses her current research on democratic theory. She's published in a wide variety of peer-reviewed venues, including an article on the results of the National Survey of Student Leaders, which has been spearheaded by tonight's speaker, Dr. Bennion. Welcome, Dr. Robidek.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tucker-Wergs. Again, I'm Katie. I'm a brand new professor here at Hood and director of the Church Center for Civic and Community Engagement, and so pleased and honored to introduce our speaker, Dr. Elizabeth Bennion, who has been such a wonderful colleague and mentor, leading me up to this position and becoming a professor. Dr. Bennion teaches American politics at Indiana University, South Bend. She's founding director of IUSB's American Democracy Project, president of the Indiana Debate Commission, director of Voter Services and Education for the local League of Women Voters, and host of Politically Speaking, a weekly PBS TV program on WNIT. In these capacities, she moderates political discussions, public issue forums, and candidate debates at all levels. A nationally recognized expert on civic education and political engagement, Professor Bennion has published widely in academic outlets, including co-editing 2 books on teaching civic engagement through the American Political Science Association, Teaching Civic Engagement from Student to Active Citizen, published in 2013, and Teaching Civic Engagement Across the Disciplines from 2017. Dr. Bennion has won numerous local, state, and national awards for her teaching and service, and this year she's been selected along with Professor Richard Davis for the National Capital Area Political Science Association Walter Beach Award for collaborative work establishing a civic engagement section for the American Political Science Association. With all that in mind, Dr. Bennion is first and foremost a warm and welcoming colleague, and it's my great pleasure to finally be able to extend her the offer to share with us her expertise here at Hood College on such a timely topic as the Electoral College this evening. Thank you, Professor Bennion.
Thank you so much, Katie. I'm thrilled to be here to talk to students and to anybody else who may be joining us this evening. Today, I'll present the Electoral College with an emphasis on how it undermines democracy and also political and racial equality. First of all, I want to thank the League of Women Voters of Illinois and its local chapters for some of the slides, many of the slides that you'll see this evening. The League of Women Voters has a 50-year-old position against the Electoral College and in favor of abolishing the college in favor of a popular vote. And that position is one that was reaffirmed and strengthened in 2020. But this has been the position, well, this party or that party prefers it. It's not a partisan position. It's about empowering voters and defending democracy. So very quickly, I did want to make sure that we're all on the same page about the Electoral College and how it works. The Electoral College are the 538 people who actually cast the votes that matter, that count, that determine who will be the president in the United States of America. This number reflects the 435 members of the US House and the 100 members of the US Senate, plus 3 electors representing Washington, D.C. Now, to be clear, these are not the senators and the House members, but the number is the same. And they're allocated based on the population in the state for the 435, just as in the House of Representatives. Each of us has a certain number of congressional districts and representatives based on population. And then in the Senate, each gets 2 senators. Well, here we each get 2 electors. And then finally, through constitutional amendment, Washington, D.C. was given 3 electors so that they're represented in this process, even if not in Congress. We can see then that a state like Indiana, where I am right now, has 9 congressional districts, and therefore we would have 11 electoral votes, the total number of representatives in Congress, House, and Senate. Similarly, for Maryland, with 8 congressional districts, add 2 for the number of the senators, and 10 electoral votes. What you need to win in the Electoral College is 270 votes, electoral votes. That's a majority, and the majority is required. If no candidate gets a majority, the election is thrown into the House with each state casting 1 vote. So the focus then is winning that magic 270 electoral votes. It doesn't really matter how much of the popular vote you get, as Hillary Clinton learned in the last election with over 3 million more votes than Donald Trump, but no presidency to show for it. So here's Electoral College, and just briefly, let's consider what this means for strategy. What it means is, if I'm looking at a state like Indiana, and I think, well, maybe I could do better than past Democrats. Should I spend my time there? And then I look up the history and I see that Indiana voted for a Democrat in 1964, Lyndon Johnson, and in 2008, Barack Obama. And that's the only 2 times. I might decide that it's not worth my time. And that certainly is what Joe Biden has decided. We see no Biden ads here and no campaigning. But similarly, Donald Trump ignores the state because he knows that he'll get the electoral votes. And we could talk in Q&A about why 2008 was different if you'd like. But this is similar with blue states like Maryland, where you often get ignored because the candidates assume they already know how the people in your state will vote. Even if I could change from, instead of getting 40% of the votes, getting 49% or 49.9%, because of the winner-take-all system that's used in 48 out of the 50 states, everywhere except Maine and Nebraska, all of the electoral votes go to the winning candidate. So look at California with its 53 congressional districts and 55 electoral votes. That's a lot of votes, but it's not contested because candidates assume it will go blue, and so they ignore it no matter how many electoral votes they have, because a Republican knows that they probably won't win that state, and so they focus only on the swing states, because even if they could get 49% of the votes in California as a Republican, 49.9%, spend so much time and effort to get that, They get 0 electoral votes unless they get more than their opponents, a plurality of the votes, more than any other candidate. And so the strategy says, I want to focus only on those states I can flip because I'm going to get all of their electoral votes, and I need that magic number to add up to 270. So why create this system? Why did the framers create the Electoral College? Well, number one, they didn't want federal legislators selecting the president. There was some talk about having members of Congress actually select the president, but this could lead to corruption. Right? Do this for me and I'll support you for president, and also a concentration of power by those people who were selecting the president. And as you'll know, and as you think about the way our system is designed, it's meant to have separate institutions sharing power, to have what's sometimes called the separation of powers between the legislative and executive branches. What that means in practice is we want some level of independence. Well, if you have Congress choosing the president, there's not much independence there. The president will be beholden to Congress. And certainly, if the president wants to be chosen next time around, they might want to do exactly what powerful members of Congress tell them to do. So that was the big problem there. So why not pursue a direct election by the people? Well, poor communication was a big concern. We didn't have a national mass media. There certainly was no internet, right? You didn't have this instant national communication. And so the framers were concerned about an ill-informed or uninformed population. There were large distances between states. And by the way, those electors never meet together as a body. They cast their votes in their state capitals. And they're also not really just one body. They have a slate of electors for the Democrats, a separate slate for the Republicans. Whichever way your state goes, that's the ones that cast their vote. And they're chosen for their party loyalty so that they'll go along rather than be what we call a faithless electors. But even to get to a state capital, there's large distances. And certainly, how are you going to get to that face-to-face rally? They don't have television. They don't even have the kind of radio that would become popular under FDR's presidency. You have this lack of communication, lack of knowledge of what's going on. There were some newspapers, mostly partisan papers, but it was very difficult for people to get information. And that was a concern in selecting a national leader. Also, there is the issue that is very relevant to the question of race, which is lost power for the southern states. A direct popular vote would count eligible voters. But if you know how the House of Representatives works under the original Constitution, what you know about is the 3/5 compromise. As a compromise to make sure that the southern states didn't give up on creating this new Constitution, one of the deals that was struck was to count slaves as both for the purposes of taxation and for the purpose of representation. The big states said they should count for representation but not taxation. The free states said no, they should count for taxation. You're saying this is property, not as representation. The compromise is 3/5 for both. Well, this would then be carried over into the Electoral College because you have the number of electors that you have members of Congress. And so that inflation of the power of the South, that counting of slaves who could not vote toward representation in the Electoral College would carry over with that 3/5 compromise in place. So did the founders love the Electoral College when people say, well, the founders created it, it must be something that we keep because the founders are brilliant, right? This is an important part of our country. They wanted us to have this. Well, as we think about the most famous names you might associate with the Declaration of Independence and with the Constitution, right? We have Thomas Jefferson, who penned the Declaration of Independence and was very involved in the creation of the Constitution. And we have James Madison, sometimes called the father of the Constitution. Jefferson preferred a national popular vote, but he worried that the southern states wouldn't agree. James Madison, despite his Virginia roots and interests, said the people at large was the fittest way to make this decision. He also preferred a national popular vote. He was willing to give up his own state's power, saying that local interests must give way to the general interest. So as we think about what the founders wanted, it's easy to use that phrase, but the founders would probably that who come first to our minds actually didn't like the Electoral College. It was a compromise, like the 3/5 compromise, to keep this process on track. And some people, of course, who are concerned about racial equality think it was a bit of a deal with the devil. So why not direct election? The poor communication, the 3/5 compromise. This was one of the last issues discussed in what is, by all accounts, an exhausting, long, hot, contentious convention. It ultimately would be described as the second choice of many, but the first choice of few, or a jerry-rigged improvisation. So this, like many things, was a political compromise. It was not seen as a fundamental and critical part of the design. There's no great philosophical or ethical or democratic theory reason to set your country as a presidential election system up in this unusual way. So many of the framers did intend for the selection of the presidency to be based on the popular wishes of the citizenry. Madison and Jefferson talked about it doing this indirectly. The Electoral College for them was seen as an intermediary system to breach the difficulties of distance and communication, difficulties that we might point out no longer exist today. But also, there was some expectation that the electors would use their own discretion, right? That they could guard against corruption or bias or misinformation. There were certainly members of the Constitutional Convention who felt that the mass public was not smart enough, wise enough, informed enough to make a decision like this. And so they wanted either the members of Congress or electors to make that decision instead. But the reality of how the college works and has worked historically is that there are very few faithless electors. These electors are chosen for their loyalty to the party. And when they do act in a faithless way, not in accordance with the wishes of the people of their states, they have faced a lot of backlash. So people really do seem to expect these electors to be a rubber stamp. When we go into the polls, we vote for Trump or Biden. We think that's who we're voting for. We don't even see the names of the electors, and we don't think somebody else should be overturning our votes. So if we think about the way the Electoral College works today then, and the reasons that it really was put into place, they no longer are very relevant. Information is widely available. Congressional selection of the president is certainly nothing that people are considering going back to, right? Or considering to really be the next way that we select the president instead of the Electoral College. And the people don't really want electors exercising their own discretion and just overturning the popular will. So why abolish the Electoral College? It's simple. The fundamental underlying principle of representative democracy as it's developed in our nation is one person, one vote. It's fundamental to the notion of democracy, that we have political equality, that each person's voice is equal to another person's. But this principle is not one that is in fact consistent with the use of the Electoral College. So you may recognize these states. These are some of the, roughly 19 or less states that are actually in play in any electoral cycle, while the other 31 states get largely ignored. Whether they're big or small or medium doesn't matter. If they're not swing and the candidates aren't sure which way they go and they're not polling tightly that they could go either way, they're just basically ignored. All the visits go to the swing states, the media coverage and the advertising, all of the attention. We also find evidence that the policy interests of these specific states and their members of Congress are higher on the list for presidents in terms of policy making. So there's misrepresentation that way as well. Maybe modern media makes this irrelevant, right? We don't need a president to visit or a candidate to visit to watch them on TV or on the internet. But unfortunately, when we don't live in a swing state and we feel ignored and we feel like the votes are already cast, right? The die is cast, we know how our state will vote. Some people think, why voting? If you are a Republican in Illinois, a Democrat in Indiana, perhaps even a Republican in Maryland, why bother to go to the polls? You feel like you know how your state will go, it won't get your way, so your votes will be tossed out due to the winner-take-all system. If you know how your electoral votes will go, why bother? Now, of course, I would point out, as somebody who creates online voter guides and does candidate forums and debates for municipal candidates and state level candidates and county level candidates and gubernatorial candidates, that these are all important. These are not the only people on your ballot, right? The presidency is not the only race on your ballot. But we know that turnout is much higher in presidential elections than it is in midterms with no president on the ballot, and certainly much, much higher than for local elections, such as municipal elections alone. So many people are most excited to be able to vote for the president, and that turnout is depressed. That not only affects presidential election turnout, making fewer people make decisions for all of us in a way that violates the democratic assumption that it's the rule of the many or the rule of the people, but it also has implications for down ballot races because you have fewer people making decisions in those other races as well. So the Electoral College does decrease voter turnout. If we look at 2016, for example, the swing states where people actually felt like their voices might matter and their votes might make a difference, we saw 66% turnout versus non-swing states at 59%. Another problem is that depicting the map of the United States according to Electoral College results polarizes us. We can see the blue states and the red states, and we talk about states like this, right? You have red states and you have blue states. Do you live in a blue state or a red state? Well, this ignores those facts at the bottom of your screen. Does anybody even know that in Alabama, 35% of the voters gave their votes to Clinton. In California, 32% went to Trump. In Colorado, 43% to Trump. In Georgia, 46% to Clinton, right? We think these are just red or blue states, and all those voters, and those are not small minorities, get erased as if they don't exist at all. As we just think of red states and blue states who are so different from each other, who have so little in common, who maybe don't even want to talk to each other and might hold each other in disdain, right? Versus if we used a national popular vote and began to think of ourselves as one united country with purple states and purple counties where we recognize that we all disagree, but we should have conversations that can be productive. We're not just red states and blue states. We're individuals with important ideas to consider. And so here you can see what it looks like for Mondale and Reagan. And if you are my age or older, you may remember this as the most lopsided presidential victory in the college ever, which it was, but that erases the fact that 41% voted for Mondale. That is not a trivial number. But here's all that anybody saw. Wow, landslide. Mondale shouldn't have even bothered to run. 13 measly little votes, right? DC and Minnesota, Reagan swept the map, right? You'd never suspect that over 40% of the country voted for Mondale. They're just erased by the Electoral College. Here we see 2012, Obama 51%, Romney 47%. That's very close, over 60 million, almost 61 million people voting for Romney. Similarly, in 2004, 48 to 51%. So we are very divided and lots of people support both candidates, but the Electoral College magnifies the margin of victory, making it look like one candidate should control the political agenda because they won the college so handily. And they're able to erase all those voters who didn't win the college. Perhaps it might be more useful to think of ourselves more like this, as people fighting together for liberty, equality, self-rule, and to establish justice and promote domestic tranquility, right, as we say in our founding documents. The other issue with the Electoral College is that the popular vote winner, of course, can lose the presidency. And that has happened 5 times in 1828, 1876, 1888, and then Now, at one time I thought, well, if it happened in the contemporary period, people would be upset. People would realize that there is an electoral college and they would want to create change. But it happened in 2016. And of course, before that, not so long ago for most of us, in 2000. And these are cases where, in the case of Clinton, 3 million more people gave their votes to Hillary Clinton and said she should be the national leader, and yet Donald Trump still won the presidency. And so that is a major concern as we think about the president representing all Americans. So some people's votes clearly are counting more than others. It's not one person, one vote. So let's talk briefly about some of the, what I am calling myths about why we need the Electoral College. And you'll hear these all the time. Number one, without the Electoral College, our presidents would all be chosen by a couple of big states like California and Texas, or maybe New York and Texas, California and New York. Well, the reality is that even if each state voted in a very lopsided way, so let's say everybody voted with a very, what sometimes would be seen as a landslide win, 60%, all for the same candidate. Okay, and not canceling each other out. So in fact, they would probably cancel each other out and need even more votes, but we'll be as conservative as possible here and we'll say, okay, they all went for a strong majority, 60%. They all voted the same candidate. We elected the president by popular vote. So here's California. Add Texas, Florida, New York. Oh, we only had 18% of the vote. That's not going to win us a popular vote. Pennsylvania, Illinois. Okay, let's add Michigan, North Carolina, Georgia, New Jersey, Virginia. Oh, only at 34%. Okay, so now we have 27 states to get to that 51% if we all voted for the same candidate by a 20-point margin. And most of those margins are not going to be 20%, and we're not all going to vote for the same. So likely you'd need even more than this. So the math is important because it sounds really logical to say, oh, just a few big states or a few big cities will control everything. But that's not actually mathematically realistic if we look at voting patterns and the way that people split their votes. So what about those cities? If they voted unanimously, those 10 largest cities, because you hear the only cities that people would care about under a direct popular vote would be LA and Chicago and New York City, and they'll just jet between those and everybody else will be ignored. Well, they'd only have 10% of the vote. 100 largest cities, 30% of the vote. So no, big cities could not alone control the presidency. And again, remember, one person, one vote. Should it matter where you live? How much voting power you have? So the fact is that votes from all states would be necessary to win the presidency. Election by the popular vote means that every single vote counts equally. People from a swing state count the same as a state, safe state, from the city, the same as the county, from a California Republican, the same as a California Democrat. So let's look at California because people are always impressed by the number of electoral votes it has. One thing we forget when we think of it as a blue state is that 32% of California voters chose Donald Trump in 2016. The Electoral College erased them all. What did that mean for California voters? A few disgruntled voters? No, over 4.5 million Trump votes just absolutely disappear. A national popular vote would ensure that that doesn't happen, whether it's Trump votes or Clinton votes or Biden votes in this case disappearing. One person, one vote. Vote by the person and not by the state. Myth number 2, smaller, less populated states need the protection of the Electoral College to ensure that their interests are represented by the president. The reality is that there are no coherent small state and large state interests that need protecting. Before you start to object, let me explain what I mean. All of our states have diverse interests. A farmer is going to be different than a computer programmer and have different interests and different economic needs, whether they're living in New Hampshire or Nebraska or any other small state, right? They're diverse economic interests. And if we're thinking about agriculture, because we're thinking about rural states and we consider rural states low population states, remember, most farmers actually live in large states like Texas, California, Florida. So our political interests cross state lines. There's no coherent small state interest. The reality is, if you look at the data, small states do not vote as a bloc in Congress, and citizens do not vote as in a bloc for president as small state residents versus large state residents. Here's an example. Clinton and Trump, 2016. Those smallest 16 states with less than 6 electoral votes split evenly between Clinton and Trump. Candidates focus their time in swing states, not small states. So big states and small states are both ignored under the Electoral College unless you happen to be in one of those coveted swing state positions. Right? The fact of the matter is that residents of larger states lose their rightful representation under the Electoral College. And here's how. Virginia has 9 times more voters than Delaware. You can see the numbers there, over 6 million versus only 689,000. But it only gets 4 times as many electors. Remember, there's extra 2 for the Senate. You're mathematically skewing things, so one person does not count as 1 vote. Some people have much more power than they do in other states. Some people in some states take far fewer voters to get 1 electoral votes than in other states. This really isn't fair. So myth number 3, the Electoral College protects the rights of the minority from the tyranny of the majority. Well, the framers did care about minority rights. They mostly were concerned, for example, with certain kinds of property owners and business owners and the way that radical mobs, remember Shays' Rebellion, might want to cancel debts and cancel property rights. So they did care about minority rights, but they weren't really talking about minoritized communities of the type that we are thinking of today, such as African Americans, Latinos, Native Americans, etc. Now, the rights of minority groups are important to protect, but we don't protect them by giving some states more power than others in the Electoral College and giving people different amounts of power to select our president. We protect them through our Bill of Rights. We protect them through civil rights laws and through the courts. Myth number 4, abolishing the Electoral College will only benefit one political party. This is all about partisanship. Well, this isn't actually true. As an example, we now know that Nixon actually won the popular vote by about 48,000 votes with the analysis that we have. It wasn't looked at that closely at the time because, well, popular vote didn't matter. That's a Republican candidate, and yet he lost. Similarly, here we see 2004, Bush received 3.01, so more than 3 million votes more than Kerry. And he won both the popular vote and the Electoral College, so that's fine. But consider, if John Kerry had received only 119,000 more votes in Ohio, Kerry would have won the election, even if Bush would have still received almost 3 million more votes than Kerry. In that case, Bush is the Republican who would have been advantaged, and that scenario easily could have happened. So in reality, what happens is voters of both parties feel that their votes don't count. Again, the Republican in Vermont, the Democrat in Kansas, whose votes are simply thrown away using the winner-take-all system of the Electoral College. Another fact, the Electoral College can and has hurt Republicans as well as Democrats. This really is a nonpartisan issue. Like gerrymandering. Gerrymandering, if you're in a state controlled by Democrats, Republicans are fighting for gerrymandering, redistricting reform, and saying that Democrats gerrymander, because they do. If you're in a state controlled by Republicans, you see it as a Democratic issue because Democrats are the ones fighting to end that control of the majority party over drawing the district lines because they're drawing them unfairly. And they're right, because both parties do it. Like the issue of gerrymandering, which the League also opposes, the Electoral College is nonpartisan. It's not okay if Democrats get extra power. It's not okay if Republicans get extra power. It's about empowering voters and defending democracy. So another fact too little discussed and important for our conversation this evening is that the Electoral College dilutes and frequently erases the votes of Black Americans. Southern framers, as we discussed, feared the lack of influence in a direct presidential election because of their non-voting enslaved population, who for some reason they thought should count for representation, both in terms of the House of Representatives and when it came to picking the president. So the framers were concerned about minority interests, but did not consider racial minorities in terms of protecting their political rights. Again, this is a time when you had people who were enslaved and had no human rights, let alone voting rights. And of course, non-propertied men, women, Native Americans, other members of minority communities also did not have political rights. The 3/5 compromise was used to determine how many electoral votes a state would receive based on the number of slaves they owned. More slaves, more votes for president. So we can see how problematic that is today. The institution of the Electoral College is deeply embedded in the racist notion and institution of slavery upon which the nation was in part founded. So how it worked, for example, South Carolina and New Hampshire had equal populations, but South Carolina had more electoral votes. So we know that the history of the institution is deeply connected to the institution of slavery, and both supporters and opponents of the Electoral College will admit this. The defense suggesting that this really shouldn't be considered as we consider race and the Electoral College is that ultimately when voting on the college, the main factor determining those votes was not slave versus free states. And that's true, because there are other reasons you might vote for or against a different system, whether having Congress decide versus the people versus the college. It doesn't change the fact that the math was completely based on the 3/5 compromise, with African Americans counting as 3/5 of a person, or certainly with slaves counting in that way. So to counteract the influence of the 3/5 compromise, Republican legislators encouraged migration to the West. Now remember, at this time, your Republican legislators are not, we have these same names, but they're not the Republicans of today. Over time, the parties take on different issue platforms. They really wanted to counteract that 3/5 compromise. And so they added small, majority white, Republican-leaning states to the nation to pick up more votes for their party. One of the things, though, is most of these remain majority white, conservative-leaning states today. Now, most Black families did not participate in Western migration. They were forced from the South to northern urban cities in search of job opportunities and to escape racial violence. And many, of course, remained in the South. High-paying opportunities, even in the North, were scarce with discriminatory programs that didn't apply, such as the GI Bill, which was not administered fairly, so that Black soldiers were not given the GI Bill in the way that white soldiers were, because the programs were allowed to be administered at the state and local levels. Similarly with redlining, where African Americans were told that they could only live in certain communities and not others. A lot of jobs, a lot of businesses, a lot of communities were not open to African Americans. And all of this has continued a racial wealth gap and has to do with the way that people settle. Which cities you live in, which neighborhood you live in, which states you live in, is how people have treated you in the past, what opportunities are available. One of the things, though, that this migration out of the South did was that Black voters would remain then a minority in every state, which gave them and continues to give them less electoral power. So the racial bias in the Electoral College still affects African Americans today. More than half of all Black voters are scattered among Southern states where they are outnumbered by white conservative voters. Because Black voters tend to vote Democratic in very high numbers, their votes are underrepresented because whites in the same states are voting for Republicans on the whole. Their candidate choice then is not taken into account, or they're always on the losing side. For example, 5 out of 6 states where Black voters make up more than 25% of the population vote red, right? So Republican, despite Black voters overwhelmingly voting blue. Here you can see 10 top states. It's labeled 3 because Virgin Islands and DC would have your highest composition of African Americans or Black people living in them. And then we go to Mississippi, and you can see that with the exception here, you have Delaware here, you have Maryland here. Most of your states are in the South. So the current winner-take-all system then alienates Black voters. Candidates campaign to undecided voters. And that's usually white middle-class voters. African Americans vote predominantly Democratic. People who are struggling economically vote predominantly Democratic. Middle-class white voters make up a majority of those swing voters, and those in those swing states, the candidates pander to, right, and listen to and try to give policy concessions to. And so the interests of Black voters then can be neglected despite their high turnout rates. Now, in the primary, that's not so true. One of the reasons that Joe Biden is the nominee for the Democratic Party was strong support among Black voters, including Black voters in the South. But in the general election, this leads to the belief that, and not completely erroneous belief, that Black voters can be taken for granted in the sense that they're not that swing voter who the Electoral College encourages candidates to focus on most. That lack of concern for racial minorities then creates the possibility of a sort of tyranny of the majority, or what has been called by some scholars white tyranny, and it leads to some possible openness to campaigns that we see today, like Walk Away or Blexit, encouraging African Americans to walk away from the Democratic Party that takes them for granted. The problem, however, with these movements is that it's not really an attempt to address the concerns of Black voters and welcome them into the Republican Party. It's more an attempt to say, just don't vote at all. And that, of course, does not lead to greater representation or more possibility of getting your interests actually represented and converted into public policy positions. So how could we abolish the Electoral College? We could urge our legislators to introduce and co-sponsor a constitutional amendment, and there are legislators who have done so. We can urge our state legislators to support reform. In this course, for a constitutional amendment, you'd need 2/3 of the House and the Senate to support a change, plus 3/4 of the state legislatures. There are some alternatives, and I have some slides, but I'm going to want to do some Q&A, so we can, if people want to know more, we can click through some of those and see more. But there is a National Popular Vote Compact. That is the idea that states would make an agreement to give their votes, their electoral votes, to the winner of the national popular vote. So no matter how their state decides, they will look at who won the national popular vote and give their electoral votes to that candidate. It has been enacted into law by 12 states with 172 electoral votes. The compact will take effect legally when enacted by states with 98 more electoral votes. You can see why, right? 172 plus 98 is that magic 270 that they need to win. So at that point, the Electoral College becomes a bit irrelevant because state legislators can decide how to allocate their electoral votes. So the idea of the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact is to say, hey, we'll get enough states to get the 270 that will just circumvent the college, right? Whoever's the National Popular Vote winner, we can make them the winner of the presidency together as states without a constitutional amendment. Another option that people often point to is the proportional allocation of electors. I've mentioned that winner-take-all system a lot. I will confess that this is the system that I used to personally prefer. keep the college in place. We're the United States of America. They gave up a lot under the Articles of Confederation to become a stronger national government and to hold the nation together. Maybe, you know, if a constitutional amendment doesn't seem realistic, but if we could proportionally allocate, we'd have representation by the states for those two equivalent to the senators, plus more, maybe not perfectly representative, one person, one vote, but closer. So this seems more democratic, at least than what we have now. And democratic here again, small d, democracy, right? Not Republican Democratic Party. So why not go with that? Why does the League oppose this if they support democracy? That's because this alternative actually makes it much more likely that the results, nobody will get 270. As you proportionally allocate all those votes in each state, you give lots of room for your third party, your fourth party, your fifth party, your sixth party, your 31st party. There are 31 parties plus none of the above who got votes in the last presidential election because different states have these different ballot access laws. That means it's more likely to be thrown into the US House of Representatives. When it gets thrown into the House, every state casts one vote. One vote. So 50 votes for president, regardless of the size of your state, from the tiniest to the largest. So this is the least democratic option of all, and it becomes more likely in this alternative, which sounds more democratic, but in practice might be the worst alternative yet. All right, I'll stop there, Katie, so we can get to Q&A, and happy to, there's obviously so much more to say, so why don't I go ahead and see what questions people have.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Bennion. I know that everyone is clapping, and from comments that we've received in the Q&A, many people appreciate how informative this presentation has been in laying out the considerations about the election of the executive by the college, by Congress, or by the people. And so I'm going to take questions in the order they come in. So please type in your questions in the Q&A, and I will read them as they come in. Apologies if we don't get to everyone's questions in the time allotted, but hopefully you continue to have conversations about the Electoral College in your classes or amongst your friends. So the first question we have would be about this dynamic you laid out between red state, blue state hurdles, and particularly when we hear this term political polarization and kind of stereotypes that seems to perpetuate. What are some productive ways that you think, and I know you mentioned the purple state option, but how could we combat that in the short term perhaps?
Yes, I think one of the things that people should realize is that people, the voters, are less polarized right now than members of Congress. It is true that in Congress, the parties have become more polarized. We can look at graphs of where Republicans are ideologically and Democrats are ideologically. And a few decades ago, there was a big overlap there in the middle where your more liberal Republicans and your more conservative Democrats met. There has been a huge sorting of the parties so that now those curves don't meet anymore. And so we have very few moderates. We can think of some who are perhaps less moderate even than they used to be with Senator Susan Collins, perhaps Murkowski, you know, a few who we know who say, well, we don't think that the Supreme Court justice should go through, or they buck their party on something John McCain when he was alive and voting for the ACA. And you have a few who you don't know which way they'll vote, but it's become very, very polarized. And that leads the rest of us to see that kind of fighting and then start emulating it, when in reality, when we are with our own families and we may disagree, we still have a sense perhaps that they are people of goodwill, that there are other things we like or even love about them, that we share some common beliefs or principles, and so we'll just and we need to keep that in mind when we think about our interactions with one another. So I think that it's really important as educators that we have discussions and deliberations. So on my own campus, I have a political controversies course, and we talk about the death penalty and torture as an interrogation technique and immigration reform and climate change. And it's amazing when you do this in a deliberative framework and you give multiple options and students have to weigh the pros and cons of each option, and we invite community members as well, how they can sort of come up with this new solution where they can find the common ground. And unfortunately, we're not seeing that from our political leaders very much right now. But my hope is in ordinary people who find this to be so much more useful and productive and meaningful than simply debating to win the point and to be the winner. And so I think that's one thing, to teach those skills. The other thing is civic literacy skills, because some of the attempts to divide us are coming from Russia. Some of the attempts to divide us are coming from folks who are using misinformation and disinformation, intentionally lying to us, and mostly lying to us about each other and trying to divide us. And so looking and finding facts, using fact check, using PolitiFact, actually looking at a reverse image search, seeing where the source was. Is this a reputable person? Is this a reputable publication? Knowing the different biases that different publications have and reading across them. All of those are great ways to actually start getting facts and realizing, wow, maybe there are a few points on the other side that I need to know about. But having those conversations in our family, instead of avoiding politics entirely, having them in our neighborhoods and in our communities is important. And it's especially important in a world in which Google doesn't show me the same thing it shows you, because it gives us what we like to see. Our social media is often a little thought bubble, echo chamber. And even residentially, we'll see signs for candidates. They often look a lot alike. And so because of all this sorting, we don't talk enough to people who disagree with us to find that common ground. But it's critical that we do if we want to move forward as a nation.
Wonderful. The next question we have from a couple of folks is about the type of democracy that we are, that the US is. And so in terms of the organization of the country as a democratic republic, so having this notion of representation that you've talked about, how does that play into the analysis of the Electoral College being undemocratic? The fact that it's not supposed to be the US either a direct democracy or anything like that, but rather a representative or a democratic republic.
Yes, thank you for this question. I'm laughing because this is my pet peeve, that people will scream at each other on the internet about this, saying, it's not a democracy, it's a republic, and they will get so irate about it. Okay, so it is a representative democracy or a democratic republic. And so it is a form of democracy. It's not a direct democracy where we make decisions on everything. There are elements of direct democracy in some states, such as ballot referendums, where you vote directly on whether or not to create an independent commission to draw your lines instead of allow gerrymandering, or other policies like legalization of marijuana. In Indiana, we don't have that type of direct democracy either, because our referendums have to go through two separate legislatures with a vote between, and then and only then will it go to a ballot. So we're very limited in direct democracy in Indiana. But one of the things we have is we elect people to make decisions for us. So the question is then, are they actually taking into account our opinion? And if we're supposed to elect them to make decisions for us, our votes should still count in electing them. But with gerrymandering, so that you draw the districts in ways to pack all of your opponents' voters in one district so you can get more than you deserve, we don't have that in the House. With the Electoral College, where majority of people or plurality of people can vote for a candidate for the national leader, and that gets thrown out in the college, we don't have that either. So if it's supposed to be representative, it should be representative with one person, one vote. So it's absolutely true, and it's a good point that we're not a direct democracy, but There are not many places that look like Athens. And again, even in ancient Greece with their direct democracy or their idea of it, there's certainly no women who were there making those decisions, and most people were not involved. It was still a pretty small group, no slaves either.
Thank you. There are a couple of questions about the odds that a constitutional amendment would happen in terms of reforming the Electoral College. So what do you think those odds are potentially if you were asked to speculate? And then are there groups currently lobbying for a change to be more on along the lines of one person, one vote as you lay out?
Yeah. So I think at this point, the popular vote interstate, the national popular vote interstate commerce is probably more likely than a national or federal constitutional amendment. But amendments can happen. And I want to show you actually this timeline here, because these are the timelines of amendments. And what you'll see is there's sort of activity and then several amendments, and a large period of inactivity, then lots of amendments. And those times of activity are times where people are really talking about fundamental institutional reform. And that is something that we are hearing now. There's a renewed push for the Equal Rights Amendment. There is a push, you heard it in my mayor, former Mayor Pete Buttigieg, when he was a presidential candidate on the Democratic primary in 2020, right? In this last primary cycle, one of his was abolishing the Electoral College. Another was changing the way we select Supreme Court judges to expand the size of the court to try to make it less partisan and less predictable based on the partisan appointment of the judge, by saying, look, you have you appoint an extra until you've got Democrats and Republicans, and then they have to both all agree on the extra 5. And so there are all kinds of interesting proposals being floated right now. And Americans don't like to easily change the Constitution, but we certainly have, let me see if I can, but we certainly do have lots of examples. We changed the Constitution to allow 18-year-olds to vote. We changed the Constitution to allow women to vote. We changed the Constitution to get rid of poll taxes in order to be able to vote, right? There are all these changes that took place in our country that have to do with who can vote. And so we've done it before, we've seen it before, so it is possible. But again, it means that you have to get 2/3 of both chambers of Congress plus 3/4 of the states. And often states don't want to give up something if they're not sure what will happen, or they're just used to things being a certain way, or they believe the myth are benefiting or believe that they should continue to benefit from a disproportionality, disproportional weight in the Electoral College. Now, if you really got all those states who are ignored under the college together, though, and convince them this is not working for you, it could happen. But it would require the public to actually care, and the public to ask at debates and at candidate forums whether or not they will support an amendment to abolish the Electoral College. And so the odds will depend on whether or not the public is educated about the issue and willing to speak up.
Great. And so in terms of another type of reform that you laid out, so proportional kind of representation, so allocating Electoral College votes that way, as is done in Maine and Nebraska. First of all, why did those states happen to go that way? Was that through a referendum initiative or state legislatures making that change? And then also, would that eliminate some of this fear about faithless electors? Was that came up in a SCOTUS ruling this summer, and was that ruling or connected to the 2016 election?
Yes, so I think you had 3 questions there, so if I don't hit them all, follow up with me. But the SCOTUS decision, I mean, that was very interesting. Essentially, the Supreme Court of the United States decided that states do have a right to make rules about the allocation of electors, which we already knew. But it was unclear whether it really was constitutional to bind them. So a lot of states have a pledge that says you have to vote the way the people vote. And many, many constitutional scholars argued that doesn't make sense. If the framers created an electoral college as an alternative to a popular vote, and some of them wanted those electors to be able to cast wise votes in the case of an uninformed or ill-informed public, then they're set up to just do their own thing, and the state shouldn't be able to punish them or hold them to account. And the Supreme Court said, actually, you know, they can. That part of deciding how to allocate will be setting the rules for these folks. And so it does diminish the likelihood of faithless electors. But the other thing that people should know about these so-called faithless electors is there really have not been very many of them, and they've never actually swayed the vote. So in practice, most have served as a rubber stamp. Now, some have done it symbolically, such as an elector from Washington, D.C., casting a blank ballot to protest the lack of statehood for D.C. She didn't face backlash because folks in DC knew it didn't make a difference in the outcome, but also they want the protest, right? They want to raise attention to the issue. Now, tell me what your other parts of your question were.
And so I think that, yeah, the fear about faithless electors being potentially covered by the proportional kind of allocation of votes to the Electoral College and Wyoming.
It could still be faithless though, right? So you could say, well, we're going to allocate them proportionally, but whether you say winner take all or proportional, you're telling it, so it's proportional. So 40% of your state went for this candidate, 40% of your electors should go for that candidate. But that wouldn't change the fact that they could say, no, not going to do it. I'm casting the other way anyway. So those aren't directly correlated or connected. Yeah.
Great. So our next question is about the relation to slavery, the institution's relation to slavery. And so when slavery was abolished, was there a push to abolish the Electoral College? And why was that maybe not in what we've heard? And if, yeah, I think that's the essence of the question.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I will say that I'd like to do more research on that time period to see to what extent some people did raise that issue. But no, there hasn't been, to my knowledge, a serious attempt to abolish the college. There have been proposals over time, but nothing that almost passed, and nothing, you know, whether historical or recently, that really rose to the level of believing that it would almost happen. Again, the league started pushing this 50 years ago, but we feel that now is perhaps the best time because you're actually starting to hear high-profile candidates talk about it, because you have these periods of activity, and also, you know, people weren't particularly interested in the Electoral College. Many didn't even know about it when they went to the polls. They thought they were voting directly for the presidential candidates because you didn't have situations, right? It's just a historical anachronism that it would be a difference. You assume that the popular vote and the electoral vote would be the same until 2000 and 2016. So now a lot more people are woken up to the fact that this really can happen and overrule the popular vote. And so that's why it seems particularly likely now. But the racial implications really have been very under-theorized, under-researched, and historically have not made kind of the impact that you might expect. Now, the combination of the fact that we may have another split decision potentially between the popular vote and the Electoral College in 2020, if that happens, plus we have the Black Lives Matter movement, plus we have more national focus on the discussion and the debate, and in many cases the desire for greater racial justice and equality, maybe these issues will be raised, and this will be the new historical moment that people will be talking about later. But no, I mean, there wasn't any kind of a real serious attempt that was, you know, close to successful and really changing the way we elect the president so far.
Great, and you said it, there's kind of this education about the Electoral College that it even existed. Some voters might not know and assume that the popular vote is what gains the presidency. And so we have a couple of questions about whose responsibility it is to provide voters with education about the Electoral College, and if you'd encourage how you would encourage specifically future educators to create a space for students to better think critically about their own place in the political world and this issue.
Yes, so I'm very glad that you asked, because I think that we do need to be doing this in elementary school, junior high, high school, and college. Civic groups can also do it through community forums. People who are interested in this issue can find lots of materials at the LWV Willamette Electoral College reform. At this point, there isn't much there about race, though I do plan to work with them on that as I continue to research and do more research in this area myself. And there is a abolishelectoral@gmail.com where people can get information. There's a Facebook page, right, where people can get involved, including teachers. And you know, what's very interesting is they actually have presentation materials, they have handouts, they have little sample scripts, they have all kinds of things that you can use to educate others, and they're all freely available. So sometimes people are discouraged because they care about an issue, they want people to know, but they don't feel like they have the information they need to really be able to effectively advocate for change. And so one thing that the League of Women Voters of Illinois through Wilmette, but other local leagues as well, is really doing is taking it national. And so now that the National League has reaffirmed and placed higher in its agenda support, not just for the interstate compact, but for abolishing the Electoral College, we're seeing more of a push to make sure that this takes place in communities throughout the country. And so there are lots of great materials available online that you can share with educators who may want to know more and may want some information that they can use and present. And students can educate each other.
Of course. And we have another question here about urbanization and increases of population in urban areas, if that has any consequence in terms of the best way to create a fair electoral system.
Well, I think one of the problems is when you hear discussions about the Electoral College and why we need to retain it, you will often hear people say, well, small rural communities need their interests protected, and I don't want just a few people in big cities making decisions for me. I don't want LA and New York City deciding my next president. Often this has to do really with partisanship, but there's also this dismissiveness of urban dwellers. The real Americans are your heartland Midwestern farmers, right? And then these other folks are not really the people who should be deciding. There's a big lap, as you might imagine, with race there as well. And so it's problematic because it suggests that for some reason, just because you live in a city, you shouldn't have the same say over who is the president of the country as somebody who lives in the country. Okay, and that is not good from a perspective where one person should have one vote and where we should have political equality. So I think there are a lot of links and there are a lot of conversations as you hear people talk about the Electoral College that are imply that, okay, to the extent that people have moved to urban areas, their votes should somehow, for some reason, count for less, that their opinions are no longer as valuable. And that's very problematic.
And another question to follow up is if there's been actually on this kind of public opinion side of things, whose vote counts, what has there been thorough research regarding public opinion about the Electoral College, whether it should stay or go?
Yes, and the majority of Americans now think that it should be abolished. Democrats at this time are somewhat more likely than Republicans to believe that. Women more likely than men, but also young voters more likely than older voters, regardless of partisanship. And so, you know, I think there does seem to be some change and some movement in that direction of like, why are we keeping this over 223-year-old institution that was made when we didn't have communication channels and ways to travel, and we have the internet, we have TV, you know, things have changed, wait. And remember, at the time, people will also say, wait a minute, didn't these same framers have us not elect our US senators, which is true. The state legislators would elect the US senators. So that changed through constitutional amendment, right? To say, well, people should do that. So this would be similar. And more people are thinking, wait a minute, I thought the people voted for president. They don't, wait, maybe that should change. And so we are seeing a majority of people in the country at this point supporting reform and supporting actually abolishing the college. The question is, how salient is it? Do they know enough to educate their friends? Do they actually ever mention it to people in power? Do people in power think that they actually will vote on this issue? Because that makes all the difference. We know, as scholars of American politics, that it's not just about the direction of public opinion, that really, it's not the direction that matters for whether or not something becomes a policy. Right? You can get 90% of Americans saying that there should be stricter background checks and you should close the gun show loopholes in some surveys, including about 86% of gun owners. But it's not policy. Why? Because of intensity of preference, right? And people who oppose are so much more likely to vote on that issue than people who support the stricter gun control regulation. And so it's not just about direction, it's about intensity. And I think that's really the bigger barrier than the fact that, you know, Americans on a whole love the Electoral College and think it should stay and oppose one person, one vote. It's, you know, do they feel confident actually advocating and actually making it an issue? And so, you know, that's where the education piece is crucial. And then letting elective officials at the state and national levels know that this is an issue people care about, all of that will matter, because salience, how much we think about something, intensity, how strongly we feel about something, and direction, all three of those things matter if you look at how policy actually is changed.
Wow, that's great. And so if we did have this policy, this discussion in terms of policy, would there be plausible arguments? You laid out myths and facts. Would there be plausible arguments for keeping the Electoral College that you can think of? And for example, in terms of a question that's been asked about the role of the courts. So could elections get hung up in courts somehow? And what would be the role of the judiciary?
Well, actually, I'm glad whoever asked that question asked, because I do think, and I wanted to say this, there is a bit of a concern that I and many others have who support abolishing the Electoral College, which is that we really should also look at the possibility of either a majority runoff or a ranked choice voting system. These are much more democratic than our current first past the post plurality winner take all system. Now we can talk about the legislature, but we'll save that for another conversation. And when we're looking at just the president, if you think about the one problem with that national popular vote is not a national recount. So that's when I did not mention that I used to put on the side of against the Electoral College, abolishing it, because that's not the way elections work now, and it wouldn't be the way elections work then. When you recount, you count in each county, right? The elections would still be run by your states and your counties, and you'd only recount like you do now if there was a problem in one specific county. You wouldn't recount the whole country, okay? So let's get that straight. But if you had the Electoral College and you are going based on national popular vote on a plurality, more than everybody else, not anybody else, not necessarily 50% plus one, not a majority. Then you do run into some problems, which is what happens when a Kanye West, for example, comes in and says, oh, I am going to try to get some African Americans to vote for me. And what will happen is then their least preferred candidate will be elected based on public opinion polls, right? So Biden second choice, Trump third choice. What happens is those candidates become a spoiler. The same is true with minor parties. So Democrats who vote for a Democratic Socialist or a Green Party candidate are making it more likely that the Republican will win. Republicans who vote for a conservative libertarian, and I'm happy to talk about why I say a conservative libertarian, because libertarians don't line up along what we think of as the liberal and conservative spectrum. But and say, like, I want to go, you know, to the right of the Republican Party, actually make it more likely that a Democrat gets elected, right? And so right now we have a system where people feel like they have to vote for what they call the lesser of two evils, or they vote their conviction and their conscience and make it more likely that their least preferred person, who is the least likely to enact the policies they want, will be in power. And so a ranked choice voting actually allows you to say, hey, this is my first choice, but if that person doesn't get in, here's who I would like my vote to go to. And if that person doesn't go in, here's who I want my vote to go to. And so there are other systems that are widely used throughout the world that we could use to make that decision of a national popular vote for the presidency more fair, allow people to really give their sincere preferences without worrying about serving as a spoiler and actually getting their least preferred candidate. And so those would be things to consider really in tandem with abolishing the college.
Wonderful. And if I can ask one more question to wrap us up here before we say goodbye after this wonderful talk and all these questions. Our final question would be, if we have the national popular vote as the way that the executive is elected, do you think there would be an increase in voter suppression in such a system for some reason?
I think there'd be an increase in voter turnout for sure, because we know safe states have depressed turnout. There are other things we could do, which is same-day registration, election day registration, automatic voter registration. These things do not create more fraud. There's just not evidence of this, but they do increase turnout. There are many reforms that can fight against voter suppression. Now, would it lead to more voter suppression? I would say no. Right now, if you want to suppress the vote, you know exactly where to do it, and you can concentrate your efforts there, right? Count where it matters most. And there are only at most 19 states that you even need to pay any attention to, and then you can break it down to the counties and see who might swing. When every vote counts equally throughout the nation, are you going to suppress the whole entire nation all at once? That would be more difficult, actually, less difficult. So that would be my response. But there are a lot of things we could change. In the state of Indiana, we have a 29-day registration, advanced registration requirement. When I lived in Wisconsin, we had same-day election day registration. And I'll tell you, a lot of students get interested in those last few weeks. They're eligible, but they're getting interested as other students start talking to them about it close to the election. And then they want to participate, and it's too late. And so that is frustrating, because the state doesn't actually need that much time to run a legitimate system of integrity. And so it's state election laws. Obviously, there are lots of things we could talk about there in terms of maximizing people's right to the franchise. But every state is different. And we also do see a number of laws that are being passed to suppress votes, as well, such as having only one place where you can drop your mail-in ballot in your whole state or in your whole county. And often those voter suppression efforts are targeted at Black communities. It's also true with radio ads and leaflets that misinform people about the election date. We recently had a case of robocalls telling people that if they use the mail-in ballot, this host of legal actions will follow against them. And so this misinformation and disinformation actually campaigns often target African American voters, and they target them in a way that's not trying to win their votes, right? Which is what we want. Like everybody should be trying to win votes, but trying to get them to stay at home. And that's a problem, but it's not one that will be made worse by a popular vote.
Thank you so much, Professor Bennion, for laying out these facts and drawing our attention to the importance of this conversation that we need to continue about the Electoral College in electing an executive in the US. And I am just echoing the many, many thanks here in the Q&A for you providing your time and your expertise to the Hood College community and wider public. Thank you to all attendees, and thank you, Professor Bennion. We are so grateful to have you launch the year-long series on race, politics, and public policy with your talk tonight.
Thank you. Thrilled to be here. Thank you to everybody who tuned in, and thank you for inviting me.
Have a good night.